Good morning, everyone. We're just waiting for the last few people to join the webinar, and then we'll make a start. It's just slowing down now. Okie dokie. Well, welcome to PASA's dashboard webinar. Whilst there's been an awful lot of talk about the technicalities of dashboards, we must always remember that savers' needs are at its heart. So today, we're going to focus on the value data that people will see on the dashboard. We've got a packed hour, beginning with Richard Smith, and he'll give us some insight into what you'll be showing to users. Maurice Titley of ITM, PASA's dashboard expert partner and co-chair of the working group, will drill down to the data itself. Rob Dodson of ITM will also the other co-chair will talk you through your choices. And then we have Lucy Stone, TPR's business lead, who will take you through what TPR expects from schemes and the regulatory approach. And finally, we should have enough time for a few questions, and Chris Connolly is going to help in answering those. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Richard.
Thanks, Kim. Good morning, everyone. It's great to speak with you all this morning. So Maurice, Rob and Lucy are going to talk about the requirements on schemes to return pension values for individuals to see on dashboards. But what we found over the last couple of years talking about dashboards is it's much easier to get your head around the concept of that if you can see what a dashboard might look like. So I'm just going to spend a couple of introductory minutes really talking about, well, these issues around displaying the numbers that get returned. A couple of important concepts and caveats. First, one thing you may hear people talk about a lot is the pension dashboard. If I can have the first slide, Heather, please. The pension dashboard isn't really a thing. There are going to be many. Level 2 in this diagram shows there's going to be one from the government, the Money Helper dashboard, and then any number of others called Qualifying Pensions Dashboard Services, or QPDSs. There are 3 in alpha development at the moment from Aviva, Bud and Money Hub, and there could be lots of others. One important concept to mention, very widespread in the open banking world, is white labeling, where household consumer brand names use a fintech's app. So you can see, but they put their logo on it, but you can see in that way, there could be many, many dashboards. And we think at Money Hub, there will be very many dashboards. Whichever dashboard the individual uses, they're all connected, as you can see here, to layer 4, the central digital architecture, and then in turn down to where I guess many of the audience today reside, layers 5 and 6, so schemes and providers and ISPs. Normally when we say there are going to be lots of dashboards, we get a question, won't that be confusing for individuals seeing different numbers on different dashboards? And the answer is no. Next slide, please, Heather. This graphic is taken from a guest blog we did on the PDWG website back in July. What it's trying to show is whether you go on your banking app or your pension provider's app or another app that's chosen to be a QPDS, the display is going to be the same. All have got to show the same figures that get returned by schemes in the same way. Those display standards are controlled by FCA rules and PDP design standards, which need a lot of debate and testing to ensure we get them right and they're understandable for users. So one thing that we've done at Money Hub, next slide please, is deliberately put our alpha dashboard in the public domain to get this debate going. I'm about to show you some screenshots, but frankly, there isn't really time on a session like this to get into the nuts and bolts of it. So at your leisure afterwards, please do feel free to go to moneyhub.com, just go to the solutions menu and pensions dashboards, and there you'll find not only the alpha dashboard I'm going to show you, but also a resources page with a video demo and lots of other bits and pieces. It's really important that we as an industry debate how these things look so that they work for consumers, as Kim said. One final caveat, next slide please, Heather, is that before we get to see numbers on a dashboard, the individual will have been through an ID verification journey and a consent journey to consent for their details to be passed to the pensions industry, and then a find process will have been run, and the all-important matching that I'm sure many of you know about, done by schemes to say, can I find a pension? We're not going to talk about any of that really important stuff today. We're assuming all of that has happened and we've got to see some numbers. Right, this is the meat of it. Next slide, please, Heather. These are my pensions. We found 9 pensions. There's a lot of caveat wording, disclaimer wording there. Read that at your leisure. What we think on the right-hand side here is what most users want to see, and the research bears this out, is one number. What total estimated income they might get per month, probably from state pension age. And evidence from I think Belgium and Italy on their dashboards is that majority of users aren't too interested in going further than this. They just want a ballpark sort of figure what they might get. We think at Money Hub it should be rounded down to 2 or even 1 significant figures, certainly no pence, because that gives a false sense of accuracy. And of course, it's only an indicative estimate. And there's obviously lots of opportunities to link out to retirement living standards from PLSA by having a total number. Where does that 2,300 a month come from? Clicking on show my pensions would take you to the next slide. You'll see, by the way, we're doing here a mobile mock-up. The vast majority of open banking users use their mobile devices, and we think dashboards will be the same. Some may use desktop browsers, but they'll be in the minority. So here is the list of pensions. These are mine. This is in career order. So I started my pensions career at the Prudential in the 1980s. So those are deferred DB pensions, and then coming to the second column there, moving to Aviva, Nest, Scottish Widows. Obviously, there's a defined contribution. Now they're all payable from different dates, so that's a bit of an issue. So we think one way to display that would be a timeline. You can see at the bottom of the third there that shows the different years and how the total would increase. Of course, I won't take the money like that. I was 55 last month, and I'm going to retire quite soon. So I won't get these numbers. I'll get early retirement figures from lots of them. So this isn't the numbers I'm going to get. It's an indicative number that I might get, if that makes sense. 2 more slides to show, which is digging into the detail. Our idea at Money Hub is that if you tap on each of the individual pensions on that list, you go through to this detail. Here, this is my first Prudential pension. Much too much to talk about in detail here, but left-hand side, this confirms that from 2027, from Pensions Half Pension Scheme, I could get £183 a month. Second column there, really important, administered by XBS. Click here for more details. So I think every administrator in the country really needs to think carefully, what landing page should that take them through to? This, for me, is the key part about dashboards. It brings members to your websites. Third column there, halfway down, the pension income built up so far is as at April 21, so it's a bit out of date. It's £183 a month. The estimated future amount, you can see there's a glitch there. This shows it's still in alpha test, but for a deferred DB, that would be the same number. And Maurice and Rob will come on to talk about that. Finally, on DC, on the next slide, this shows left-hand side from 2034. I may get an Aviva personal pension that gives me £483 a month. Again, administrative data on the second column there, clicking through to Aviva for more details. On the third column, halfway down, the amount built up so far. So far, I've built up £450 a month. That's at July 21. And that's generated from today's fund, or July 21's fund, of £180,484. Looking to the future with a Simply projection, in 2034, very top of the fourth column, I might get £483 a month. And that's from a projected fund of 194,000. So a fund growth of about 14,000 over the next 13 years to 2034. Lots of detail there. As you can see, we put very little design effort into the UX here at Money Hub because we're waiting for the PDP design standards, and then probably won't look anything like this. And that's probably a caveat I need to say, that this isn't a dashboard because FCA hasn't yet made the rules for authorizing QPDSs. So this is a potential dashboard of what it might look like, but I fully suspect it will iterate a great deal between now and the launch of dashboards. So closing off, final slide from me, Heather, is we've got FCA consultation on those rules coming that I mentioned. We've got the PDP's consultation on design standards coming. Lots and lots of beta testing with volunteers over this autumn and winter. And then even as we move through the staging process from next April, lots and lots of further testing to refine dashboards so they land well with consumers when they're launched. And that's me. Over to Maurice.
Thank you very much, Richard. So, I mean, I think it's really interesting to see the view that Richard presents in terms of what dashboards are going to look like. And this comes through quite a lot in what we're going to talk about, particularly in my section. So yes, can I have the next slide, please? So the first place to start, I think, is to look at the gaps that you might have in terms of being able to provide the pension values that are required to show on the dashboards that Richard's been showing. And I think the first stop that you should make in looking at this is just to look at what you know about how your scheme is administered at the moment, what you provide to members on a regular basis. And dashboards requirements are, largely speaking, designed to say, well, we think most schemes are already providing this information under disclosure regulations, therefore it should be relatively straightforward to provide it on to pensions dashboards. Now, of course, that's not entirely the case, and we'll explore that a bit more as we go through. I mean, broadly speaking, and I expect most of you on this call will know this, if it's defined contribution pension values, you'll be looking at SNPIs of some description, depending on how the consultation lands in terms of the changes that are going to be made to SNPIs. If you've got defined benefits members who are active, you're hopefully covered by what you're already doing for benefit statements. Again, there might be some problems with that we'll touch on as we go through. If you've got defined benefit deferred members, then the requirements are to provide a value that's revalued up to the current point in time or the end of the last scheme year or whatever that may be. And we know that a lot of schemes don't hold data in that way. They only hold the data at date of exit. So there may be some more gaps that need to be filled for those members. So first thing to do is have a look and understand what you generally provide and what you don't provide. And that could be on your main administration platform. It could be that you have member engagement platforms that provide projections in a slightly different way to members, and you know, you'll be aware of that for any particular scheme. So then looking down, you have two sort of groups that you then will end up with. You end up with those who are already being calculated in some way. So here's an interesting question. Can members actually already see these numbers? So we do know that we have some admin platform clients that calculate numbers that would be useful for dashboards, but they don't actually get put in front of members at the moment. So are the numbers that are being produced fit for putting in front of members? If they're already going in front of them, great, that very much ticks that box. The second question is, within that group, have you got a difficult pile? So have you got individuals who, for whatever reason, are not calculated each year and have to have some kind of amendment made to them, or maybe they're waiting for data from an employer that means you can't calculate them? Do you have members who have more sort of permanent issues in their data that mean that they need special treatment? Or do they just need special treatment for reasons that are connected with the benefits that they have? Are they complex cases, unusual exec benefits? Have they got divorce complications? So there's plenty of reasons why, even though you're currently calculating, you could have a difficult pile that you've got to consider. And then you've got the whole group of members for whom you're not currently calculating. So this may well be deferred members with DB benefits. That's the classic sort of case where this will be this will be the problem that you've got to solve. So for these members, the first thing that I'd think about is, have you got the data to actually carry out those calculations? And most schemes will have deferred benefits, deferred member benefit data at date of exit. That will be held for most, but is it reliable enough to actually carry out the calculations that you would carry out? Do you know that there's a difficult pile that's going to be created once you do solve this problem? And then when you have the difficult pile, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to handle that? Are you going to consider defining rules that work around some of the complications that you have? So, for example, if you know that some of the data is unreliable, can you take the data that you do trust and produce a valid estimate for those members that you think is good enough to actually use on pensions dashboards? So I think that's the starting point, is looking at what you currently calculate, what you don't, and where the administrator has issues with certain groups of members. I think the next thing to then look at is how the regulations and the emerging guidance that we have actually change the line in terms of what you're going to have to do. So you know that dashboards ultimately are aimed at providing the numbers that you would provide to members, but are they actually requiring some additional information to that which you normally show? Richard talked about payable dates and how you might want to see how a pension builds up over time on the dashboard, because that's perhaps the only really sensible way of presenting it. So do you have temporary pensions within a member's pension entitlement that you would want to identify and you would need to actually provide separately because they will have an end date, and that, if you, as you saw on Richard's diagram, it would make much more sense to sort of show that build up, and that might be something that you don't currently calculate when you calculate a benefit entitlement for a member, and do you need to actually introduce that into what you do on a regular basis? You also need to show other sort of data in terms of spouses entitlements and also any other complications where dashboards is asking you to do things such as consider defined contribution underpins in a way you never have done before. So dashboards might have raised the bar in terms of what you need to actually show. So can I have the next slide, please, Helen? So the next thing to think about is, are you actually going to produce this information just for pension dashboards, or are you going to produce it for wider purposes? And this is a very key question to consider. So if you are looking at the example of defined benefit deferred members, for example, that we've already talked about, if you're going to follow a scheme method for carrying these calculations out, then there will be rules that define that, and you could then use the data that you produce there and the numbers that you will then hold for other purposes as well. And you might use them as part of your administration process. You might decide that if you're going to revalue this data every year in a way that you haven't done before, then actually why not use that and actually calculate the final retirement benefits based on that data. If you're actually going to focus just on dashboards, then there are other options that are open, and you may well be aware of this interim simple method that's been talked about in the regulations, that is going to be allowed for a period of 2 years to do something really straightforward and just take the position of saying, right, we have an inflationary adjustment that we can apply to the pension that we know is increasing pension, and actually let's do the most simple thing that we know we could apply really easily. And Rob will talk a little bit more about how that could be applied in the next section of this presentation. The other thing to think about if you're just calculating for dashboards is that there are a whole set of warnings that you can pass up to the pension dashboard to say, look, this isn't quite the whole story. There's some element of this benefit calculation we haven't included. If you want to get the whole story, then you can come back to the administrator, as Richard was showing, link back through and actually obtain that. And you might be familiar in the data standards that there's a list of warnings that have been defined in the most recent version. There's specific ones about pension sharing, ADC benefits not being included. There's also the very helpful other significant warning, call the provider for more information. So you may well want to actually take advantage of that for some of the difficult cases that we were talking about before. However, you may not. You may decide that you don't actually want to calculate a value for everyone and fall back on the 3 and 10 day rule. Now, if that's the case, there are some implications. So Heather, if you could go to the next slide, please. And the implication falls around a lot of what Richard was talking about, in that we do believe, and anyone who's really sort of thought about this and the research that's been carried out backs this up, that individuals who are using dashboards are going to be really interested in what the total is going to be. Now, we don't yet know exactly what the design of dashboards is going to look like in terms of the design standards. So who knows? Is it absolutely guaranteed there's going to be a total on there? We don't know that for sure, but what we do know from research is if there wasn't a total, individuals are going to add this up. They're going to want to find out what their estimated income in retirement actually looks like as a total. So let's assume that there are going to be totals on dashboards. And what you can see in this slide here is we have the two totals. In this case here, we have a total, that the higher total is the one that assumes that the individual keeps saving when they're actively accruing pension that they have. The other one assumes that they don't do that. And you can see on the right-hand side the breakdown of the individual components of those totals. Now, there's a big warning flag shown at the bottom, and this warning applies no matter how this is carried out, that these figures are estimations, and they always will be. And the further away we are from the member's point of retirement, or the payable date that's been used here, then the more estimated those numbers are. We know that DC numbers are estimated in ways that are very different to DB projections, but they're still not the numbers that the member is actually going to walk away with. So I think we have to take some faith that that users of dashboards will get the message that this is not the final number. And I know there's lots of concerns that individuals will look at an individual number and then go back to the administrator and say, well, this is different to what you've told me. But I always think that that's a kind of an unavoidable consequence of giving the individuals this really valuable information, which is, what do these things look like in totality? What does this actually mean for your retirement income? So this is what it looks like if every pension has returned a value. Now, just playing around with this a bit. So Heather, if we could have the next slide, please. So let's say 2 of those don't return a value. So let's say they're defined benefit pensions, and that value has not come through for the bottom 2. So again, design standards caveat, who knows if remotely dashboards are going to say, wait 10 days, come back. But we know from the regulations that the 10-day klaxon sounds, as soon as the individual uses the dashboard, they have that 10 days to, the administrator has that 10 days to provide the number, so that when the individual checks back, that's going to be shown. So in this example, 2 of the pensions are missing from the party, and hence the 2 totals that you see are significantly lower. And there's a nice warning on there saying these figures are understated. Some values are still to be provided. Now, that may well be the way this works. Obviously, individuals can have many pensions. You know, Richard's got far more than 4 in his example. If you have just 1 missing, yeah, showing the total of the remaining ones seems the right thing to do. An alternative, if we could have the next slide, please, Heather, might be to say, well, we just don't know. And it is worth saying that, you know, if somebody checks in to see what their retirement income is going to be, if they're not seeing the complete picture, they're not walking away with what they wanted, what they came for. And they might mistakenly, they might hopefully think that the missing item is the one that's going to give them the comfort and you know, and move on, and not perhaps take the action that they would have taken had the missing item have been there. So to us, I think getting everything on there seems to be so important, and it's hard to see how in 3 days for DC or 10 days for DB, something's going to be done to calculate something that couldn't be calculated in advance or couldn't be coded up to be calculated on the fly. And Rob will cover, you know, what the difference between those 2 approaches could be. But it's hard to see why you wait to do that until you get to that point. And if you have members who you just haven't got the data to calculate it, the employer hasn't given you the data. So, you know, is there something you could put on there? Is there some way you can produce a number that's of some meaningful use as part of a total? And I think that's, you know, that's very much the way that we see this. If people take this approach, then yes, they'll avoid having this clock ticking, and probably end up putting the same number on there they would have done after the 10 days in a lot of cases. So that's an overview in terms of thinking about what you want to show and how you would deal with the complexities. When it comes to some of the finer details of what you need to provide that we were covering earlier on the slides, we're very conscious of the fact it would be really helpful to have some more guidance. And as a sort of invitation to everyone on here and anyone else who you know, if you would like to send any examples through to the PASA working group, we'd be delighted to see some of the challenges that you face on your schemes. And we are keen to produce some guidance over the next few months on some of the specific areas around pension values, because there are some grey areas in the regulations, and I think schemes would really value seeing how certain things are being dealt with. Issues, particularly some of the ones that have come up recently, are where there might be multiple ages that benefits become payable at, simply due to Barber windows. What's the approach going to be there? Is there going to be a sort of standard industry approach to doing that? And if so, we're very keen to publish some guidance from PASA to actually start helping with that process. So yes, that's just a call for any input that anyone can give, and of course very happy to hear what you have to say with the questions later on. But in the meantime, that was very much around what you want to show. Rob Dodson from ITM is now going to go through the key considerations about how you could actually get there. So over to you, Rob.
Great stuff. Thank you, Maurice. Yeah, so good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here. So yeah, as Maurice talked about, Richard has covered the points around how important the visualization of data is for end users, and Maurice has talked a little bit about what the values might be that you want to present. But I'm going to talk to you just a little bit more on the how you might want to get there. So yeah, Heather, if you can do the next slide, that's perfect. So the first thing to be preparing for is thinking about, well, how long have you got to get this done? You need to be prepared for sharing your pension values from the date of your staging deadline. But really the kind of question comes from that is to how many requests you're likely to get and from when. And so recently DWP issued a second consultation which focused on the DAP, or Dashboards Available Point. And for those who are not familiar with the Dashboards Available Point, this is the time when it's expected that dashboards are officially announced as live for use by the general public. But whilst the dashboard's available point time is not yet known, it is likely that your system will receive queries ahead of that, particularly as PDP steps up testing with live data. So what is expected about the dashboard's available point is that this time is likely to result in that highest concentration of requests. And it's been found that in other countries that roughly 50% of their first year of requests occurred on the day that dashboards are announced, and so therefore really resulting in a significant spike of queries. And I'm sure Lucy will touch on this point with you, but you must provide value data immediately if it is based on a statement provided to the member in the last 13 months, or a calculation made for the member in the last 12 months. And when this is not the case, you only have 3 working days to return value data for DC, and 10 working days for all other cases, such as things like DB and hybrid benefits. But the question really remains is, do you want your teams hit with a significant volume of requests to turn around calculations in those 3 to 10 working days? Not to mention any other questions or queries you might get from dashboards during that time. So touching on Maurice's point, what can you do instead? Well, you can begin to work on this now. And the reality is that you have between now and the point the member logs into dashboard in order to respond. But rather than leave it to that last minute, you can make sure that you have the systems and processes in place to get prepared. And whilst there'll no doubt be some members needing more complex calculations and therefore taking longer to prepare, we feel it's likely many schemes will hit the typical 80-20 rule, with roughly 80% of members taking only about 20% of your time. And so therefore those might cover the ones that are subject to standard scheme benefit structure. So therefore we urge you really to be pragmatic and don't leave it until you get that large flurry of calls. If we could have the next slide then please, Heather. So what do pension values in real time mean for you? So we need to think about how frequently do pension values actually need to be updated for them to be meaningful for your members. So wearing our other hat as a software provider of ISP solutions, we are often asked, well, how frequently should data be updated for dashboards? But the reality is it does depend on the type of scheme and the turnover of members. So for some schemes, such as a closed DB scheme, it's likely annual updates will be frequent enough. But what about schemes with a rapid turnover of members? So for example, a new member's value data must be provided as soon as you can, but the regs say no later than when you first produce a statement for them, or 12 months from the end of the first full scheme year that they have been in the scheme, and whichever of the two is soonest. But it's not only when you show the values. The other question is about how are your members going to interpret the age of the values you present? So will they realize that some of the figures could be, say, up to 12 months old? And I think Richard actually put a post on LinkedIn fairly recently on this very interesting topic. And it brought home that the frequency of updates can result in a confused member experience, especially when you consider that your annual benefit statement, your online portal if you have one, and your pensions dashboard response could all have different values. And the example that Richard highlighted is that, his benefit statement, already 2 months out of date, was significantly different to the values within the online portal that the schema provided. So confusion caused by differing values could not only lead to, say, poor choices by members, but could also result in increased number of calls and admin. And therefore getting the frequency right and making that in line with the expectation of your schemes via other communication mechanisms is absolutely key. But there does have to be a pragmatic decision about how frequently a calculation needs to be made in order for it to be real time. In reality, many schemes are based on the performance of underlying funds, which are typically only valued daily. So appropriate refreshes of data to give real-time value could be annual, it could be daily, but at minimum, it really should meet the regulatory demand and be in line with your members' expectation of the scheme. So yeah, Heather, if we could have the next slide, please. So we've talked about what real-time calculations might mean to each scheme. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes thinking about how we get there. So a review request is a message from the pensions dashboard requesting the administrative, signpost, and value data be returned. And at the present time, the coder connection from the pensions dashboard program is stating that a view request response time should be less than 2 seconds, with a recommended response time of 1 second. So as we've established, real time doesn't necessarily mean the calculation needs to be more recent than daily. However, it is possible that some organizations may choose to perform calculations, say, on the fly. In other words, well, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is performing the calculation upon receipt of the view request. Now, however, the requirements set out by the current coder connection are really to give the user a good, solid experience when they view their pension details. It wouldn't be great for members if they had to wait a long time to get their pension values after already having to wait quite a significant time potentially to see all the pensions following the find process and matching. So therefore, if calculating on the fly, calculation engines would need to be suitably scaled and suitably performant to be able to respond to multiple requests, and remembering that the peak of requests are likely to occur during that dashboard's available point and other pension awareness announcements which follow, and so therefore all having to respond consistently during peaks within that 1 to 2 seconds. So choosing this option does mean that pre-calculation doesn't need to occur and calculations will always be up to date. However, they may be up to date, more up to date, than necessary, and really require a potentially over-engineered solution to achieve that, which relies on the availability and integrity of that data 100% of the time. And so then the question also arises, well, what else in the back end would need to be changed to accommodate this? So Heather, if we can move on to the next slide and talk about another approach you could consider. So the other alternative for ensuring real-time data, in this instance, instead of calculating values on the fly when each view request is received, calculations can be performed in advance and at the frequency that's applicable to the scheme. So as discussed previously, this could be daily if appropriate, or even annually for, say, the closed DB example. So the challenge with this approach is that systems and processes need to be in place to enable recurring calculations and robust systems to create the required values. However, by taking this route, calculations have already been performed at the required frequency and data is readily available for the requests received and can easily be returned in the 1 to 2 second time frame. Now, this mechanism could allow for a cohesion of values and an alignment between key communication across different channels, such as things like annual statements, online portals, as well as values on dashboard. But ultimately, it's what is right for you as a scheme, and therefore you should be discussing these options with your providers, as it certainly won't be a one-size-fits-all solution. So great, if we could have the next slide, please, Heather. So we've gone through when to prepare, talking a little bit about how frequently calculations need to be performed and what real-time values might mean for you. So now we're going to look at where to perform the calculations. So the obvious choice for many will be to update the calculation process which feeds the pension admin system or the online portals if you have them. And where the calculation can be used for multiple purposes, this is likely to be the ideal solution, simply providing those values to your ISP or alternative, and making them available for dashboards. But it isn't necessarily the only solution, and it might be in some cases that the value required for pensions dashboard are only needed for that purpose, for example, a closed DB scheme. Now, additionally for DB, it may be that the scheme chooses the option of an interim simplified DB calculation like Morris mentioned, which may not necessarily be appropriate to mix with your main calcs engine. And so therefore, for this scenario, it may be that placing this burden actually on the ISP may be more appropriate, as it can provide a dashboard-specific calculation without the need for taking up, say, resource and expertise required to update your main system. Additionally, it might be ideally suited for your current system if it's, say, running legacy technology, and hence changing or adding calculations might actually be quite cumbersome. So it's worth bearing in mind that the dashboards is also in its infancy, and there is likely to be a considerable amount of change. And so, do you want to be making admin system changes annually, or would you prefer changes made centrally on a structured data set just for dashboards, such as something like an ISP? So it's all these things to consider when coming up with your approach and discussing the various options that you have with your providers. So I'll just come down to the last slide, if we could, Heather, please. So hopefully you found that a little bit helpful, talking a little bit about when to prepare, considering for what frequency of calculation is best for you, and what the term real time really means for you, as well as where you could actually perform those calculations. But before I just finish off my section and hand over to Lucy, I just wanted to remind you of the pension value checklist released by the PASA Pensions Dashboard Working Group, which is a helpful checklist just helping to identify where gaps exist, how to plug those gaps, and when to make decisions. And as Morris said, we're very much looking to produce other guidance, so watch this space and please provide your input. So thank you very much. I'll hand over to Lucy.
Good morning. Thank you very much. You'll be pleased to hear that I'm the last to speak, and then we can get on with your questions. So next slide, please, Heather. I'm here to talk a little bit about what we as the regulator expect and what we are doing in practice to help you comply and ensure that schemes are complying. So next slide, please, Heather. You'll be pleased to know I only have 2 slides. So the reason that we care so much about value is that dashboards can only work if savers can trust the information in front of them. So that means that the values shown aren't misleading to an excessive extent, that they are relatively, they must be recent. You can't just send value at leaving if they left in 2004. They had to be calculated on the right basis, so following the right rules, and they have to be provided in a timely manner. And that is key to the user experience. I mean, Morris already talked on the fact that if everyone takes 10 days, it won't be conducive to a good user experience. So what do we expect to do, schemes to do at this point? This is what we set out in our guidance. For us, the first step is really about auditing your data. You need to understand the data, not just the value data, but obviously the data you'll use to match savers, and understand what is there, the quality it has, what needs digitizing, and put a plan in place to make the improvements you need to make. The next step is to think about how are you going to return data which isn't recent. So for example, if you're providing benefit statements for DC members, the chances are you will be using those. But what happens for deferred DB members where you've not been issuing annual statements? So you have 2 options, as people have discussed. You can either calculate on request, 3 days for DC or 10 days for DB, or you can prepare that data in advance. So you could revalue the data annually, you could automate calculations, etc. And once you've worked out how you're going to provide up-to-date data, you need to put the systems and processes to do so. So either the automation, the revaluation process, or making sure that you've got access to the right people to do evaluations within 10 days, including the scheme actuary. You also need to make sure that values are calculated in line with the legal requirements. So there are, for DC, this is ASTM1, and FRC has consulted on changes to that. So when the final changes are announced, you'll need to make sure that the systems and processes are updated so they're calculated on the right basis. For DB, it's about calculating in line with scheme rules or on a simplified basis for a temporary period of time. And the one thing, less so for this audience, but that we're saying to all our trustees is it's really important to speak to the administrators as soon as possible about all of the above. So these are the practical steps we're expecting people to take and we set out in our guidance. Next slide, please. So this is the value data is one component of dashboards, but there's obviously quite a lot to do to get ready. It's about choosing how schemes will need to decide how to connect, they'll need to prepare their data, need to be able to match, we need to return their value data. There's a lot to do, and we recognise that as the regulator. And so we are being quite proactive. We are wanting to engage very proactively with industry as it prepares for dashboards. We have published guidance. There's a checklist that can help trustees check the progress they're making. We have published a webinar, and I believe today we will be publishing a podcast, a conversation between Chris Curry from the Pensions Dashboard Programme at MAPS and David Fairs, Executive Director at TPR. We attend industry events such as this one. We also have a programme of one-to-one engagement with leading ISPs, administrators and schemes. And critically, we will be writing to all schemes at least 12 months ahead of their deadline to confirm our understanding of their deadline and take them through the journey. We'll be writing at several points in the run-up to their deadline. In parallel, we are also building the systems and processes we need to monitor compliance. So this will be data-led. We'll receive data directly from the ecosystem and the architecture that PDP is building. But also you'll see that the Pensions Dashboard Programme at MAPS has consulted on reporting standards. Some of those reporting standards is to help us monitor compliance. We will have a range of powers. There are new powers in the proposed regulations, but also we can use our existing powers such as information gathering, or even if we uncover real, very critical issues, we have powers such as removing or appointing trustees. We want to be transparent. We will be publishing our compliance and enforcement policy for consultation in the autumn, so we encourage you to engage with that. But generally, we will take a pragmatic approach. However, we will be robust when we see willful non-compliance. There is no excuse not to try and do this. So that's the picture I wanted to paint. Hopefully, between all of us, we've given you a good idea of what you should be doing and various ways to approach it and the consequences of not approaching it. And back to Kim.
Super, thank you very much. Well, that was hopefully a really interesting perspective on what we need to show people. If all the attendees can put their cameras back on so people can see the whites of your eyes. We have had some questions come in, and one of them I think we'll put to Chris. I omitted to tell you where Chris was coming from, and basically Chris is seconded by PASA to MAPS to help with delivery of dashboards. And there's one question here which I'm going to put to you, Chris. It's come from Faye Henrik. On the value data, is it just pension value, or do we have to show tax-free cash or any other sort of value?
Thanks, Kim. Yes, so if cash by way of commutation is an option, then no, you don't need to send that. You just need to send the core benefit, which is the pension itself. If you've got a scheme that has separately accrued cash, so perhaps a sort of 1/80th pension and 3/80th cash type scheme, then you will need to send both numbers to give the member the full benefit. But if anything's optional, you don't need to send options, just send the core benefit. Perfect.
Right, and we also have a question from Claire Fuller, and I think this is one concern that a lot of schemes have, and that's if people, when they come to retire, find that the pension values are different, then will the administrators and the scheme spend a lot of time responding to queries or complaints on that? And what effectively would happen if they go to one of the regulators, sort of to say that this is wrong. So it would be good to actually have some kind of perspective from the working side, and also Lucy, if you can just sort of make a comment on that as well. You know, if you find that. So, Morris, would you like to? Oh, Lucy, you start from the regulator.
Okay. So I was going to say, to an extent, it's an existing problem, isn't it? Because all benefit statements, etc., are indicative, and so people can challenge at retirement, saying, "Well, it's not in line with the benefit statement you sent me." Obviously, there's a different volume. There'll be more people using it, but in terms of the regulatory action, not necessarily the kind of impact on people pick up with the phone. But the point is, if you have provided value in line with the legal requirements, which are in the regs, and in line with the data standards that PDP has set out, you have met your legal obligation. There will be warnings on dashboards that explain this is indicative. And if people still misunderstand despite the warnings, you have done your legal duty. You've provided the data you should have provided. So you wouldn't be liable for that, if you see what I mean, because you've followed the rules.
Perfect. And do you think that sort of from a practitioner's perspective, do you think that this is going to be an issue, raising sort of queries, or is it something that it's just part of the fabric of being a practitioner? Morris, I mean, you're sort of into data, so you must have a lot of experience from schemes.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose my sort of view on this, Kim, is that an awful lot of the numbers that are going to be produced by practitioners heading onto dashboards, they're going to be a long way out from the individual actually taking any pension, and it's this long way out that is so important to have this feeling as to what your total retirement income is going to be in today's money. That's the thing that we haven't got at the moment. I don't have a clue what mine is, to be honest. I haven't tried to look at it, but I'd really like to know. And I think that's one of the absolute key sort of requirements of dashboard. So I do understand that as you get close to the point of retirement, of course it's going to generate more queries. And I think probably that is down to the fact that those individuals will be more engaged. They'll have had more heads up as to what their pension benefit is going to be as a whole. They'll be taking more interest in pensions, and that might increase some of that traffic, which obviously is a problem that needs to be dealt with. But it feels to me that the imperative is to get numbers up there wherever possible as quickly as we can, because that's what we're all trying to achieve with this.
Perfect. So, well, that leads on to another question we had from Lek Ahmed, and that is, for those members where they don't hold the dashboard data, do they calculate this in the 10 days and then send it direct to the member, or do they upload it somehow to dashboard, to a dashboard? Chris, would you take that one?
Yeah, certainly. So I think it's important to understand in the overall architecture of dashboards is that you don't sort of push anything anywhere. You're responding to a request from a dashboard. So if you're in the situation where the member is advised to come back in 3 or 10 days, they will need to come back to a dashboard session to initiate what's called the view request again. And then you just need to make sure that if you've done the calculation manually in the meantime, that you've uploaded it to wherever you need it within your application to make sure that that value is then available to be shown on a dashboard. So you're not posting it or pushing it anywhere. You just need to make sure that your system's updated with it, or you've given that value to your chosen ISP to present it for you.
Okay. And Phil Norton has asked a question, is effectively to PDP, but I think said, will a standard for rounding of values be implemented? Is it misleading quoting a total value to £100 if one of the values is only accurate to £500? So coming back to the point that I think it was it you, Morris, that you were talking about sort of you know, what is useful for people to see. And in some senses, maybe Richard, you could follow on because you've been doing such a lot of work on what people are seeing. So Maurice, if you want to start, and then Richard add to that.
Right, thanks. So yeah, I'll just, in a sense, jump on the point that Richard made earlier. I think rounding and spurious accuracy, yeah, it is really important to not have spurious accuracy on how we present these numbers. Otherwise, yeah, it really takes away from some of the arguments that we've been making that estimates are good enough. So yes, I'm conscious I'm probably repeating your point from earlier, Richard. So yeah, what's your thoughts?
It's all cool, Maurice. I like the fact that you're a long way from retirement, Maurice. You know, you've been on this for years. So I think, so some of you may know I'm also dashboards consultant at PLSA, and one thing we've been consistently saying at PLSA is 2 words: user testing. So one thing I'll be pushing for at Money Hub, for example, is asking a whole bunch of users, how accurate do you think this number is? Okay, and then we'll be showing the different variants. We'll be showing them £583, £580, £500, and we'll be testing reaction to understand that better. So this is what I mean about, you know, there'll be a lot of iteration of the front end and the iteration of the standards. The international evidence is the standards iterate when you actually launch the thing to large numbers of users. And as Lundström, who runs the Swedish dashboard, said to me, Richard, when you launch the thing, you realize what you've got wrong. So the standards will iterate through, and that's why this beta testing is so crucial. If anyone's got any evidence on how accurate they think their members think numbers they currently see are, then please do send that through. Get in touch with the PASA working group. That'd be really useful to build on that evidence.
Perfect. And then Brendan Doherty has asked a question which sort of follows on to that, talking about that one figure that could be presented to users, and how do we see the different retirement ages impacting on that? I know you had that sort of diagram on the potential dashboard, but if you're showing one figure which might be comprised of different delivery dates of that income.
Yeah, I'll jump in again there, Kim, if I may. Yeah. So shameless plagiarism, we pinched this at Money Hub from the Danish dashboard, pensionsinfo.dk, which is the oldest in the world. It's been running for 23 years. And they have one number on their homepage, and then immediately they cut to the timeline to show, but be aware, this isn't all coming into payment at the same time. But there may be options for you to bring it into payment early. If you want to find out about those options, talk to your schemes and providers. So really, this dashboards can never hope, even the oldest in the world can't hope to, Danish one, can't hope to be everything to everybody. It's an indicative estimate to get you interested, to then have further dialogue with your individual schemes about things like early retirement options, tranches, etc., etc.
Okay, right. I think this is one for you, Rob. It's come from Adam Scarf, and it's one I've heard quite a bit. What about the requirement for DB schemes where ABCs are held by an external provider? I.e., do the ABCs need to be shown, and who does this? Is it the trustee or the external ABC provider themselves? Do we have Rob, do we have an idea on that one?
Yeah, I can take an initial stab at that, but I expect Maurice and Chris will also have a view.
And Lucy.
Yeah, excellent. I think one of the key challenges with if you get the values direct from the ABC is that, do they have the same personal identifiable information as the main scheme? Is that up to date, and are they using the same matching criteria? And so therefore the question is, if you hooked up the data direct from the ABC, will you get the same result as you do for the scheme? The other challenge, though, is that if you ultimately consolidate the data onto one system, you've got to work out a way to group it and link it and come up with unique IDs, which presents its own challenge. So I think really it depends about which is the best operational solution for you, and also which is likely to result in the best member experience given that different personal data. I don't know, Maurice, if you want to add something to that.
Yeah, I just, in a way, just sort of add to what you've said by just saying you either have a pension values problem, or you have a matching problem, depending on which route you take, as Rob has described. And either way, there's definitely some work to do. I think with our clients, they tend to be leaning towards showing them themselves, but not all. And there's been some interesting discussions with external ABC providers as well. So yes, that's what I done. Lucy, did you want to add something else?
I just wanted to say that to be clear, ultimately it is the trustees that need to make sure that all the relevant values are shown. So what we say is we're agnostic as to how you do this, whether you do it, you bring the ABC values to you and then now back out, or you think. But the point is, it's really important for trustees to speak to both the ABC providers and the administrator of their main benefit as soon as possible, and get those conversations going about how best to do this.
Super.
I think just so I could add, I think the other important point, I agree with all of those about if you, the scheme and the ABC provider are sending the data back separately, the data standard does support that. There is a pension link field that both providers need to use the same number for. There are instructions on how to do that in the standards. The other thing is timing. So you'll need to have that conversation with your ABC provider, because the ABC provider might not know when your scheme staging date is, and they should not make the ABC information available earlier than that. They don't have the legal right to process that. So you'll have to liaise on timing as well.
That's going to be quite an interesting one, isn't it? I was just about to say it's quite a quick one. But from Blair Carmet again, and it's about this rounding down issue. Will it be done in the dashboards, or will schemes have to provide that rounded data? If indeed it is, once the user testing is done. What do you think, Richard?
Well, of course, DC incomes under SIMPI will already be rounded, you know, and the new version of the SIMPI projections already rounds down the numbers. I think the debate is still to be had on DB, isn't it, Chris?
That's right, yet to be determined. I think it would be, we'll just need to make it clear as we go through the consultation on the design standards, that if it's not going to be put into the FCA rules, then we will have to deal with it in the data standard.
Right, okay. Well, we're almost at the end. We've just got a couple of minutes left. So just before we have one final question, I will just say that the whole of the recording will be available later on today, maybe tomorrow, depending on our timing, on the PASA YouTube channel. So if anyone wants to, if missed any or wants to bring some colleagues in. And there was one final question, and I think probably to you, sort of, Lucy. It's coming back to you know, obviously what the regulator is looking for is to have a good member experience, for it to deliver, for dashboards to deliver on their expectations. But what if trustees are having a problem getting that, and it's not their fault? They've done everything that they can. The regulator's got these third party powers. Just a word on that before in the last minute would be great.
Yeah, that's right. So you can find out all about it in our forthcoming compliance and enforcement policy consultation. But the proposed regulations do provide us with third party powers. So this is where a trustee is in breach, but we consider that the reason they're in breach is because of a third party's action. So typically it could be the ISP, it could be the administrator, it could be an employer not providing the right data. And that gives us the opportunity to go after them with a compliance notice or penalty notice, and so on and so forth. So we will explain a little bit more about that in our compliance and enforcement policy. But you know, we are driven by outcomes. There's no reason taking action after trustee if they've done everything they could, and you know, what is the outcome we would achieve by penalising them, by finding them? That wouldn't make sense as a pragmatic regulator. So as I said, there'll be more in our compliance and enforcement policy, but then we will be given the powers to go after third parties.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Well, we've fulfilled our hour. And thank you ever so much for Lucy, Rob, Richard, Morris, and Chris. And I hope everybody got as much as they could out of that. Again, you can look at the whole session on YouTube later on today. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, everyone, for listening. Bye.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Thank you.